Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of United We Pod, your friendly neighborhood political history podcast. From Columbus, Ohio, my name is Yosef.
My name is Laura, and I'm from Northeast Ohio.
And this is Emily from Cleveland, Ohio.
In light of the events that transpired in November of 2016, I realized that there was a serious need for everyone to stand back, take a deep breath, and take a good hard look at the political history of America to better understand who we are as a country and how we got here. We thought that a great place to start this discussion on American political history would be the Federalist Papers. These are a series of 85 essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay in the 10 months following the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The Federalist Papers were aimed at convincing the state of New York to ratify the Constitution. They were published under the collective pseudonym Publius, after Publius Valerius Publicola, one of the founding consuls of the Roman Republic in 509 BC. Publishing under pseudonyms was actually a pretty common practice at the time. The idea is that you want to focus on the arguments, not the people making the arguments. And Hamilton, Madison, and Jay actually managed to keep their identities under wraps until sometime in the early 1790s. The Federalist Papers, we think, are a great place to start this podcast because they lay out pretty systematic arguments in favor of the Constitution, which at the time was actually extremely controversial and in fact was almost never ratified. And we'll talk about that. Now, keep in mind that the Federalist Papers are essentially propaganda. They were persuasive writings aimed at convincing people to do something. So you see a lot of hyperbole, you see a lot of specious arguments, but despite that, they're still probably one of the best expositions of the merits of the Constitution. They're in-depth, they give great insight into what the worries were at the time. So we're going to devote an entire season of this podcast to the papers. Over the course of about 20 to 25 episodes, we'll be exploring the Federalist Papers and connecting them to current events. We don't pretend to be free of political bias. No one is, but we want to educate people, not primarily pontificate. So with that, let's get started. Our agenda for today. Our goal for the first episode is just to explain the historical context of the Federalist Papers. So this episode is going to be a little different than the upcoming episode. It's going to be focused less on the content of the papers themselves and current events. It's just going to be more about the historical context, what was going on at the time. It's going to be less conversational. It's going to be more scripted just because we have a lot of material to go through. So we're going to begin by talking about our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. What we have now is actually our second Constitution. We're going to discuss what happened in the years following the end of the Revolutionary War and why the Articles of Confederation were failing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the Constitutional Convention, and I do mean a little bit. Just so much happened at the Constitutional Convention, but we're really just going to give a very brief overview of what happened. And then we'll talk about the first Federalist Paper, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Anti-Federalist Papers. So, Articles of Confederation. As I said, the Articles were our first Constitution. They were ratified in 1781, several years into the Revolutionary War. And they were less a modern constitutional framework for government than a military alliance of mostly independent sovereign states. And this was precisely the problem. It worked fine during the war, but it actually came to endanger the existence of the Union. So, what do the Articles say? Why were they so problematic? I think the best way to approach this is just to compare the Articles to the Constitution in a few key areas. And it'll become more apparent over the course of the podcast as we get into the papers, what the differences were. Just in short, the Articles of Confederation were way more democratic and way more populist than the Constitution, and they ceded way more power to the states. There was only one House of Congress. The members were not elected by the people. They were appointed by the states. There was no executive. There was a very limited judiciary that basically just had jurisdiction over maritime law. Congress couldn't raise its own troops. It could only requisition troops from the states. Laws had to be passed by a two-thirds supermajority, which made things really difficult, as we'll see. And the two really big failings of the Articles of Confederation were that, on the one hand, Congress had very limited powers over commerce, And Congress also couldn't levy taxes, could only requisition funds from the states. So basically, it could request money from the states. It could not compel enforcement, and it couldn't tax individuals. This last point is hugely important, and it was one of the main drivers of the Constitutional Convention that took place several years after the war ended. These things just made it exceedingly difficult for the national government to regulate commerce and secure itself. And I will now turn it over to Laura to tell us about the Treaty of Paris and what happened there.
Yeah, just in short, to get through the Treaty of Paris without reading any of the subsections, the Treaty of Paris was the agreement that I shouldn't even say United States, it was, should we call it America at this point?
The Union, maybe? I don't know.
Union, the Confederacy, yeah. We had entered into a treaty to end the Revolutionary War with Britain. It was incredibly important that we enter into this treaty because Britain was the largest military superpower in the world, and, they could have sailed away from our shores, but they can just as easily come back. And we had been losing a lot of men in the war. So it was imperative that we enter into this treaty. But one of the big things were just all of the debts, what they considered to be bona fide debts. And I tried to do a little research and wasn't able to find out what they considered to be a bona fide debt. But we were supposed to be paying back Britain an estimated $150 million. Which,
was that in dollars back then or today?
I think it was in dollars back then, which just seems astronomical. I hope it's in dollars today. I can't even imagine. It might have been 150 million total to Britain, Spain, and France. Just that number is so incredibly high. But nobody was paying it back. We didn't have a government with funds to pay back the debt. So when the treaty was agreed to, the states were supposed to be paying it back, and nobody was supposed to impede the states paying back these debts. Well, there is the state of Virginia, which was the largest state of the Union at the time, or Confederacy, and they owed half of the debt to Britain. So if you're thinking about millions and millions of dollars just out of Virginia alone, and they weren't the ones signing this treaty, guess what they're doing? They're totally ignoring it. Like, they are just based on their own interests, like just throwing in the garbage can. There was another problem with the state of New York where part of the treaty, we had promised to release loyalist prisoners of war. Not uncommon from the way that we handle the end of wars and conflicts now, where we free our prisoners of war. That's what we were supposed to do. But New York City just absolutely refused to release some of their loyalist prisoners. And this caused a lot of problems for us. We have John Jay. He's one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. He was actually the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time I'm going to be talking about, and this is 1786. This is 1986. This is October of 1786. Everything had kind of come to a head, and Jay actually wrote a report to the British ambassador, John Adams, and the British representative in New York that said that there had not been a single day since the treaty had taken effect in which it had not been violated by one of the states. And it sounds like John Jay is totally telling on us, but he had to do this because Britain already knew that we were violating the treaty. But things were getting pretty serious for us. Britain was our largest trading partner and the largest threat to our security. Like I said, they were the most formidable world superpower as far as military. And just because they beat us doesn't mean that they were going anywhere. But what happened was...
You mean we beat them?
Yeah, we beat them. I did get that one wrong. Yeah. In violation of the treaty, they decided not to abandon their military forts in Detroit and Niagara. Jay found out about this in September of 1786, so this was a month before he basically told on us. He found out that not only did they not abandon their forts, but they were actually fortifying them. And like I said, I mean, I cannot stress this enough. They were the world superpower militarily. This was the British Empire. Like, nobody messes with the British Empire. And here they are bringing more back into our country. So John Adams really he's got a really forceful voice in American history. But being the person that he is appointed minister to Britain, and he's pretty outraged that they're on our forts. So he writes a strongly worded memorial. He calls it a memorial, and he requires that the British withdraw from their posts immediately. John Jay didn't see this memorial and the requirement until it was too late, but he knew exactly how they were going to respond. They were just going to say, hey, remember how you just keep violating every single article of the treaty? You know how you're not paying any of your debts back? Well, guess what? Like, if you're not going to fulfill your end of the bargain, we're not going to fulfill ours. So the debts were still for the states to pay, and they were not paying them. And we ended up looking like an infant country. We were supposed to be this great experiment that was born from a successful revolution. And really, Europe was laughing at us. They believed that we were just going to turn into about 2 to 3 confederacies. We weren't going to have any national authority. And there was really no reason for any of them to enter into any treaties or trade agreements if they didn't have to. We just looked incredibly weak. And even a year later, it was in 1787, Jay wrote to Adams, trying to sound optimistic, saying several of the states have been honoring the treaty, and there was good reason to believe that others will do the same. So in the end, only 7 states actually ended up not violating the treaty. And Britain was honestly happy that it was just the majority of the colonies that or their former colonies. So 7 was a majority, and Britain was like, that is enough for us, and they left.
So basically, you know, the Articles of Confederation allowed all this to happen, right?
Right.
So
Zero power.
Yeah, again, you had states, you know, choosing whether or not they wanted to comply with individual treaties. The federal government couldn't really enforce any kind of compliance. There wasn't really a strong national military. Again, federal government could only ask the states for troops. Just kind of complete chaos. And then also just another quick point, you know, Britain started enacting some retaliatory trade restrictions on the U.S. following the war. And in response, a lot of the states wanted to enact their own restrictions, you know, things like laying imports on foreign goods. But the states basically just ended up not only retaliating against the British, but against each other. You know, one state would impose tariffs on goods entering its border either from another country or another state, and in response, another state would do the same. Before you know it, you just have complete economic chaos. And again, the Articles of Confederation allowed this to happen. So, and you know, I mentioned before that the lack of a taxing power also caused huge problems and was one of the main drivers of the Constitutional Convention. It actually almost led to an armed takeover of the United States following the end of the Revolutionary War, in an event called the Newburgh Conspiracy. Thankfully, George Washington saved the day. And Emily, you want to tell us how George Washington saved us from an armed takeover?
I would love to. And to sort of take it one step back, it's never quite clear as to whether or not it was truly going to be an armed rebellion, a true mutiny. But I guess those are some of the questions that history leaves for us. It's kind of fun that there are some question marks out there. And if our listeners have not already gotten the tunes from Hamilton stuck in their heads, I'm pretty sure they will by the end of this episode.
I still have not listened
oh my goodness.
To Hamilton.
You'll have to do it when we're all finished with the Federalist Papers. But yeah, so let me take you back to 1783. We were up to 1787, I think, with Laura there. And this gets down right to the heart, the Hamiltonian heart of it, which is money. And the issue of the authority of the Continental Congress to basically provide funds for the Army. They had financial obligations to the military, and they had no ability to tax the states They were relying on irregular voluntary payments from the states called requisitions. In 1780, a resolution was passed by Congress to provide half pay for all retired soldiers for life. And here we are in 1783, the setting for the Newburgh Conspiracy, and there were no funds. In 1781, a movement of nationalists, including Robert Morris, Hamilton, and a few others, supported an amendment to the Articles of Confederation that would allow taxation for the Army and for foreign loans. And as Laura pointed out, that was not successful. That was rejected by the Continental Congress. So there we are with no ability to raise any funds at all except by the willingness of the states. The British threat was receding, and the Army started believing that with that gradual retreat, there was no chance of getting any pay. And you have to keep in mind, these people had been fighting for a long time. Some were really, at this point, impoverished. They had families back home. They had maybe not even been paid in 3 years, or even longer. And these nationalists were stoking the unrest. And by nationalists, I mean people that were hoping to create a more unified government, such as Hamilton.
And Washington was a nationalist, correct?
So I think he was, but not to the extent that I'm calling them nationalists.
Okay.
I think the nationalists were.
Well, I mean, he was one of the Federalists, along with Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, one of the ones who's really pushing for a stronger national government.
Right, but as we'll see in this example, he is not willing to go to all ends, which I think in this case the nationalists were. They were stoking unrest. It was basically there's a big question mark as to whether or not it was truly a coup d'etat planned by these extremists. Hamilton had hinted to Washington prior to this conspiracy of the power of a complaining army, and it was just probably, I'm trying to think, I think it was like a few days before we're going to take you. The delegation, they said, we have borne all that men can bear. Our property is expended. Our private resources are at an end. And a delegation met with Madison and Hamilton, trying to persuade them of the true power of this mutiny. Hamilton thought it might be a handy lever, and I'm taking a lot of my information from Chernow's Washington: A Life, and also from the Mount Vernon resources for Washington. So if you're interested, please do dive deeper into those because they're fascinating. Washington: A Life is one of my favorite. I think, Laura, you have an affection for Jay that I have for Washington.
I do.
So
I'm a Jay.
Right?
Yeah, I read the boring 600-page book on John Jay, founding father.
Right. So we all have our favorite founders. But
Yep.
So Hamilton in February was writing to Washington very candidly, talking about because of the American finances that an officer revolt could be helpful. And so that's kind of the setting we're dealing with. Hamilton is much more brash. Hamilton's much more candid, generally, than Washington, I think. So Washington replies to him on March 4th and says that the sufferings of a complaining army on one hand and the inability of the Congress and tardiness on the states of the other are forebodings of evil. So his feeling about all of this is that the financial concern and the feeling of exclusion from congressional decisions and funding is basically risking the very foundation that they fought for. And he talks about the revolutionary blood that was spilt and is really concerned about their conduct and how it's going to set apart the new nation. And so at that point, on March 10th, so you understand that there's this background of nationalists working, trying to push for this sort of more unified government, and they're not all willing to just talk about it. So there's a lot of questions as to whether or not somebody from Horatio Gates's camp, whether Alexander Hamilton was behind this. Nobody really knows exactly who it was, although Washington, in a reply to Hamilton, names a Colonel Walter Stewart He said he had come to the Newburgh camp and told the officers that public creditors would support their mutiny as a way to guarantee repayment of their loans. And Stuart further suggested that certain congressmen supported the mutiny as a way to prod delinquent states into paying their promised taxes. So in the letter, it's not clear that Washington is actually accusing Hamilton of plotting, but he's definitely sort of exhorting Hamilton to...
Were they working with the Russians at the time?
You know, I think they always are. They always are. No, just kidding. So on March 10th, based on all of this discussion, there was an anonymous call for a meeting of the officers in Newburgh. And John Armstrong gave an inflammatory address. He encouraged the officers to abandon moderation and give the Congress a forceful ultimatum, that is, that they would either disband the army and leave the country without any protection. And keep in mind, they are still actually volunteers at this point because they are not being paid. Whether or not they were going to be volunteers at the beginning is a different question. And then the other option that he presents before the officers is that they refuse to disband after the treaty signing and essentially have the threat of a military state because they had all of the power then in the new country. Washington is not happy about this. Now, Washington, just as a person, is very, I want to say idealistic. I think that's the best way to describe him. He's very attached to the new country, the great experiment, as Laura mentioned, this idea that we have to stay better and purer and have the integrity that no one else does. So he actually is very upset about this meeting because this is an unofficial meeting. And before the meeting actually happened, he had told his officers that they could not go. So Washington calls a meeting 4 days later as a follow-up, and he implies he's not going to be there. So he implies that the first meeting, they never should have had it, but he will sort of condone the second meeting, although he's probably not going to attend. So they assemble, and Gates is getting ready to step up to the chair to chair the meeting, and surprise, surprise, Washington enters. And he proceeds to give an extremely powerful address. And this is like a hornet's nest of angry officers. This is their follow-up from their first angry meeting. And he stands in front of them and he basically castigates them and tells them, this, first of all, you weren't supposed to be here at this meeting. This is completely improper. And second of all, whoever's encouraging these ideas is not a friend to the army and is not a friend to the country. And he very harshly castigates them for a while, but then he suddenly breaks with that tone and does a personal appeal. He gives a personal appeal, calling himself a faithful friend to the army, and says, essentially, it was I among the first who embarked in the cause of our common country. I have never left your side one moment, but when called from you on public duty, I've been the constant companion and witness of your distress, and not among the last to feed and acknowledge your merits. It can scarcely be supposed at this late stage of the war that I'm indifferent to your interests. He reads a letter from a congressperson that's in support of them, Joseph Jones, and at that point, he starts to break down a little bit, and he can't read quite well because his eyes are failing him. And that, it could easily be suggested that was rhetorical flourish, although I don't think anybody ever accuses Washington of that. But Rochambeau says, George Washington was fine until 3 years ago, and those who have been with him constantly since that time says he has grown old fast. So it kind of reminds you of our current phenomenon of presidents going into the office and then coming out looking extremely aged compared to the way they went in. I guess we all do that. Job. Right. We do that to people. But so at this place where he's replacing his glasses because he can't read, and he says, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me." And this has a huge effect on the officers because he's showing so much weakness, but also he's appealing to their mercy. He says, "I've grown gray in your service, and now I find myself growing blind." And some of the officers literally wept at this moment. And it was so clear at that point that the threatened mutiny had ended they actually approved a unanimous resolution saying that they reciprocated Washington's affectionate expressions with the greatest sincerity of which the human heart is capable. And so, of course, everything worked out perfectly, right? And they all got what they wanted. Oh, wait. Instead of getting those, instead of getting the half pay for life.
There was a butt coming.
Right. I mean, it did get better. Instead of getting a half pay for life, they got full pay for 5 years. But they had completely averted that threat of the military takeover. And Washington, just to sort of go back to what he said, he actually wrote many, many impassioned letters to Congress and explained basically to Joseph Jones that if any other dissent should arise, that he would not be able to quell them and he wasn't going to be reliable for that. So I think he basically gave the new Congress one pass and he said, I will step up this one time and defend this. And after that, it's up to you guys to deliver what you've promised.
So what's that was definitely a lot of information. So what's like the 10-second overview, like bullet point events, what the Newburgh conspiracy was, what happened?
So I think the key things are to sort of look at the weakness of the Continental Congress for financial matters. So they can't deliver on promises. They can't defend themselves, therefore, because without an army that they're paying, a standing army cannot afford to sort of live, support their families, things like that. So they needed a more reliable way to fund foreign debt. They needed a more reliable way to fund their army. And I think it was very clear at this point that they couldn't rely on those state requisitions. And then I think the other thing to keep in mind with this is that there is this sort of growing, although it's quelled by Washington and his sincere star power, he is not going to be able to sort of stem this movement forever, this nationalist movement where there is just this push for we need unity, we need a stronger government, we cannot rely on individual states to take care of federal issues. So, and people may disagree with my interpretation of this event, but I think that that's really what it tells us, is that even a military, we're looking at a federal military here. We're looking at a national military. We're not looking at state militias. And I think when we move on into the Federalist Papers in future episodes, we will talk about why there are a lot of weaknesses in that Confederate system, in that state-based system. But I think this is one good example, because there's no way all the states individually would have been able to win the war, win the Revolutionary War. And bringing together a national army requires national funds.
This is definitely something only George Washington could have accomplished, though. He really was a special person.
He was.
And,
reading the biography of him, it's on some level, it's just always hard for me to believe he actually existed and that there isn't, this lost chapter. Because, growing up when I did, I've seen a lot of politicians fall from grace. And I think the thing about Washington, and we'll again touch on this in future episodes and throughout the Federalist Papers, the thing about Washington is that he was ambitious. I believe he truly was ambitious, but he also embodied the idea of the citizen leader and the reluctant statesman to an extent. Although I think to an extent he sort of had that was part of his own image of himself, and so that's what he tried to portray. But I think sort of the idea that other people would encourage him to do things if he wouldn't necessarily volunteer himself for things. But there's nothing wrong with that.
I think he was the first person, wasn't he? I think he was the first person after Madison to come into the Constitutional Convention, and he was the only military person at the Constitutional Convention. So he really always held a very special place. He was all in 100% from the very beginning.
He was a fascinating slaveholder.
It's true. An interesting thing about him, though, is that, his relationship with his wife, he didn't have any children. His relationship with his wife was so unique, and they talk about when people would come and visit he and his wife, and they would sit around on camp stools. They were not they were just really, I feel like on some level, he was very authentic. So, and as you point out, Yossi, he was not perfect. We're looking at a man who did own slaves, and you're looking at, he does agree for the most part with the nationalist movement, the idea of a stronger Federalist government, but at the same time, he believes so much more in moderation and integrity that he's not willing to do sort of like whatever it takes to get there.
Yeah, what's interesting is at the Constitutional Convention, at the time, it seems like the consensus among a lot of people was that slavery was eventually, the institution of slavery was on its way out. I mean, it took another, almost 100 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, but people seem to be aware that slavery was on its way out. And he said, or he even took some of his slaves to the convention, but there was a quote, and I don't remember what the quote was, but the essence of it was something along the lines of, it's this terrible institution, so I'm just going to keep the slaves I got, and I'm not going to buy any more. So I'd like to move on.
Yeah, let's definitely approach this on a different day, because I have some pretty strong feelings about this, and how much we should forgive them and how much we should move past it. Yeah, I think it's definitely a topic for another day.
Yeah, and so just moving on, there's one more event before getting to the Constitutional Convention. There's one more event that I want to talk about that really points out the flaws in the Articles of Confederation, and this one is really, really important because it was brought up time and again throughout the convention. It's brought up time and again throughout the papers. And this event is the infamous Shays Rebellion. So following the war, farmers in rural western Massachusetts and everywhere really were really getting screwed. The economy was shit. The British were shipping goods to the U.S. on credit, but that credit was drying up and they wanted paid. Problem was hard currency was difficult to come by, especially the further inland you went, since a lot of farmers were still operating on a barter system. And farmers were essentially being hauled into court and having money and property seized. Tens of thousands of farms were foreclosed on, and the economic situation at the time, I really cannot stress how bad it was. It is regarded as probably the worst economic situation in the United States until the Great Depression. And John Hancock, the famous signer of the Declaration of Independence, that big beautiful signature there, your quintessential populist figure, was elected governor of Massachusetts. He won something like 90% of the vote, and he refused to enforce the court orders against the farmers or help creditors collect their debts. This obviously made him really popular among the farmers, but not so much among the creditors. Problem was, things started getting out of hand with all the uncollected debt, and a political crisis was brewing. He basically faced two choices. Either he kicks farmers out of their homes, or he incurs the wrath of the wealthy merchants and creditors. So what did he do? He resigned. Ostensibly due to health reasons, but I think people think he wasn't actually sick. He was just sick of being governor. He was replaced by James Bowdoin, a wealthy merchant who basically took the complete opposite tact. He not only enforced the payment of the debts, but also of delinquent taxes as well. So he was going after the farmers, and he was going after them hard. Daniel Shays was one of those farmers. Shays had never been paid for his 5 years of service in the Continental Army, and then to add insult to injury, he's being dragged into court for his debts. So he and a number of others started a resistance. They began peacefully by requesting that the state issue more paper currency to help them. That way, money would be available and inflated, which was good for the farmers, but bad for the creditors. And there's this whole thing with paper money at the time. It was still kind of a new thing. Not everyone liked it. Debtors really liked it, again, because it inflated, so they could pay off debts more easily. But creditors and wealthier individuals like Madison and Hamilton viewed paper money as an attack on property rights. So, August of 1786, the legislature, hearing Shays and the others' petitions, adjourned without considering any of them. Obviously, this pissed them off. So in response, Shays and the other leaders of the growing resistance prevented the local courts from sitting physically. So they were going from courthouse to courthouse, mobbing the courthouses and preventing the judges from sitting, with the reasoning that if the courts couldn't sit, judgments couldn't be issued against the farmers. So in response, the Massachusetts Supreme Court handed down indictments of all the leaders, who decided to then go shut down the Massachusetts Supreme Court in response. Shays went to the Supreme Court with 300 farmers, and they were met by roughly 300 militia. There wasn't any violence, though. There was just protesting. And over the next several months through October, more and more courts were shut down. This pretty quickly came to the attention of the political elites in Boston that there was this giant rebellion brewing. Obviously, government wanted to quash the rebellion. Problem was they didn't have any troops and they didn't have any money. So they actually had to personally finance a private militia of about 3,000 men to try to quash the rebellion. In January of 1787, so this is like 7 months into the rebellion, Shays and his rebels storm a federal armory, the Springfield Armory. However, the private militia later tracked them down and managed to arrest a lot of them. Over the next month or so into February, there were some more skirmishes, but they were ultimately put down by the privately financed militia. Governor Bowdoin then started imposing really harsh sentences on the rebels, but it proved to be pretty unpopular, and John Hancock, magically feeling much better, returned to trounce Bowdoin in the election and gave pardons to everyone, including Shays, and Shays also eventually got his pension. So the long story short is that, thanks to the Articles of Confederation, lack of a taxing power, lack of troops, lack of a commerce power, all this fun stuff, complete chaos reigned in the absence of a strong central government, and there was a constant danger of civil insurrection. So, finally, this brings us to the Constitutional Convention. We could do several episodes. We could probably do an entire season on the Constitutional Convention. There's just so much that's ripe for discussion.
We should do a dramatic reenactment, maybe.
Ooh, I like it.
Next season.
How about an interpretive dance?
I'm not sure if that would
the Constitutional Convention. It's conceptual art.
Next season.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, there's just so much that happened at the convention. So I'm just really going to give a very, very broad overview of what happened, because honestly, the debates that they had, we're going to be discussing all the same arguments throughout this podcast series that they had at the Constitutional Convention. Because remember, the Federalist Papers are just arguments in support of the Constitution. I just think going into detail on the arguments made now on our first episode would just be putting the cart before the horse. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of the big key proposals and a couple of the big political divisions. So the Constitutional Convention met from May 25th through September 17th, 1787, 230 years ago, in Philadelphia. They met pretty much all day, every day. I think it was six days a week for 4 months in the summer, indoors, no air conditioning, probably very little bathing, and lots of tension. Don't even want to know what it smelled like. James Madison arrived more than a week early, and he immediately set to work drafting what became known as the Virginia Plan. By setting the stage like that, Madison was able to control the agenda from the outset, and he had an enormous impact on the outcome. And again, without going into all the details, the Virginia Plan called for what was really a shockingly undemocratic and elitist system of government compared to what was in place at the time. He wanted a bicameral legislature, a powerful executive, a powerful judiciary, very little direct participation by voters, only the lower house of the legislature. He only wanted the lower house directly elected. And quite notably, he proposed a federal veto power. So he wanted the federal government to be able to veto any state legislation that it wanted. Now, most of the elements of the Virginia Plan did eventually become part of the Constitution, not necessarily in the details, but the broad concepts, with that one big exception of the federal veto power. He did manage to get a kind of consolation prize with the Supremacy Clause instead, that basically says that federal law is the supreme law of the land, so states can't pass laws that conflict with it. Or if they do, they'll be struck down by courts. And
that includes treaties like the Treaty of Paris. They can't directly violate treaties. Yeah. Very important.
Interestingly, though, despite the fact that Madison got most of what he wanted, he actually was really butthurt about it, about the federal veto power, and he viewed it as a failure, a big failure on his part, that he couldn't get the federal veto power, and he was basically like writing letters to his dad just complaining about it. And, the thing to remember is that Madison, Hamilton, Washington, Jay, all the other key Federalist figures actually really hated democracy or excessive democracy. They thought that excessive democracy was the cause of this exceedingly shitty situation that the country was in at the time. And honestly, they were definitely probably right to a good extent. State debt relief laws had hamstrung the economy, and weak state governments with very limited powers and very short terms in office meant that you couldn't really have effective public policy. And this is, one of the big themes, following the end of the Revolution through the drafting of the Constitution, one of the big themes was a retreat from democracy and populism towards elitism. And this is a little bit counterintuitive because you normally think of the American Revolution as this revolt against a tyrannical monarchy, this whole thing about taxation without representation. But you got to remember that the framing of the Constitution took place in a different era. This was more than a decade after war against Britain was declared. And the Constitution, in many ways, was really a counter-revolution against the excessive populism of the American Revolution. And, just as an example, this is one of my favorite quotes, an example of how they viewed the populace and the common man. When they were debating the method of selecting the president, George Mason, one of the Virginia delegates, he was in favor of the electoral college system, which is what we all, know and love, because, and I quote, "It would be as unnatural to refer the choice of a proper character for chief magistrate to the people as it would to refer a trial of colors to a blind man." So they really had nothing but contempt for the common man and the common man's ability to make a decision on who should lead them. And, again, to this day, we have the Electoral College. We don't technically directly elect a president, although it kind of really just serves as a rubber stamp on, to an extent, the popular vote. Obviously, you can still win without getting the popular vote, but
it is ironic when, the populist movement is successful because of the Electoral College.
Yes, that is, I hadn't thought of that. Yes, that is funny. So now there was really just a ton of disagreement at the convention. And a lot of the divisions were either between small states and large states with regard to representation in the legislature, which actually almost caused the entire convention to fall apart after just a few weeks, or between the North and the South on economic issues. For example, you have the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise, and this is bringing up slavery again. In short, everyone pretty much agreed that the lower house of the legislature was going to be apportioned according to population. But the North and the South were divided over how to count the enormous slave population, which actually equaled or exceeded the white population in several states in the South. So the South wanted to count slaves to increase their power in the House. The North wanted the opposite. And eventually the compromise was that for purposes of apportionment, each slave would count as 3/5 of a person. Now, what's interesting here is that the stated reasons at the convention for why the South wanted to count the slaves and why the North didn't, they obviously weren't making those arguments. The South wasn't just saying, oh, well, we just want to increase our voting power. And that's not what was happening. What was kind of interesting is that in this case, the Northerners were actually the ones arguing that slaves were property. Because in their minds, the argument they made was that if you didn't count your cows and you didn't count your horses, why are you going to count all those humans you own to do your work? And then the South kind of argued the opposite. They were saying slaves were laborers and were an integral part of the economy. But then the North pointed out the hypocrisy of the South on this point because the South did not include slave populations in apportioning their state legislatures. The Constitution largely, I think in part it was a product of kind of the Lockean idealism that reigned at the time, but it was also largely just standard interest group politics.
As your resident moderate here, I have to stand up. I do think there are a couple of politicians in the mold of George Washington that at least believe that they are doing the right thing.
Yeah, but again, as I said, I think it is it's a mixture. It's again the kind of idealism of the time, The whole natural rights, that those ideas were coming to the fore at the time. I think it's partially a product of that, but then also in equal measure, standard interest group politics. Again, going back to Washington and his slaves, where he's basically like, yeah, slavery is terrible, so I'm just going to keep the ones I have.
Right.
These are all complex people living, in a complex time. And ultimately, in the end, the Constitution, the proposed Constitution that came out of the convention really was an enormous change from the existing governmental structure. You now have 2 houses of Congress, one of which is directly elected. You have a pretty powerful executive. You have a pretty powerful judicial branch. You have much less democratic participation. At the time, people only voted directly for the House of Representatives. The Senate didn't have direct elections until the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913. And technically, to this day, we still don't directly elect the president. Again, it's through the Electoral College. You had long terms in office, 2 years for the House, 6 years for the Senate, 4 years for president. Actually, Hamilton wanted a lifetime president. You didn't actually have presidential term limits at all until after FDR. It was just tradition because Washington said that he was only going to serve 2 terms. These are what Madison referred to as successive filtrations to limit the effect of populism. So you elect the House, and then that's the only direct participation, and you have the levels of government get kind of increasingly isolated from direct election. And one thing to note here that's interesting, and it's one of the reasons the Federalists ended up succeeding in the end, getting the Constitution ratified, was that the Federalists really controlled the procedural aspects of this whole thing. They were able to force an up or down vote on ratification. In other words, they weren't going to amend the Articles of Confederation. There wasn't going to be some partial ratification of the Constitution. The state ratifying conventions, it was an up or down vote. This helped them greatly following the convention because it was all or nothing. Everyone knew that the Articles were failing, and despite the fact that the Anti-Federalists actually greatly outnumbered the Federalists pretty much everywhere, if they didn't adopt the Constitution, it was probably the end of the American experiment. So voting for something they didn't like for a lot of people was better than letting the whole thing collapse. Other factors helped the Federalists as well. They were generally better educated. They were wealthier. They were concentrated in urban areas, so they could exercise more clout over the state ratifying conventions. And importantly, and this gets to the Federalist Papers, they also had almost complete control over the newspapers. So newspapers at the time, just because of economic constraints, were largely concentrated in urban areas where you had a lot of Federalists. So they managed to really control the message that was getting out. And, newspapers were, in a lot of cases, really in danger of shutting down if their sponsors, who were mostly Federalists, pulled their sponsorship. So they really managed to control the message. Over the, this took place in the summer of 1787. Over the course of the next year, there was really intense debate over ratification. And honestly, it was, in a lot of ways, just like the 2016 election. You had propaganda, you had fake news, you had violence. I think I remember one story about a man being killed. You had politicians just hurling insults at each other, saying one thing in one location, another thing in another location. It was just like politics today. And, no one knew whether the Constitution would be ratified by enough states to make it binding. It ultimately was, but it took a while, and the margin was razor thin in a lot of states. So we're talking like 55-45 splits or even closer. And New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify it in June of 1788, thereby officially establishing it as the law of the land. They needed 9 out of, by the I think it was Article 7 in the Constitution. By the terms of that article, it takes effect upon 9 out of the 13 states ratifying it. Now, there were some holdouts, and those were mostly the states that were really concerned about the lack of a Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about another time, because the Bill of Rights didn't become part of the Constitution until after it was ratified. There were a few holdouts, again, mostly those states. Now, the last state to ratify was Rhode Island, which was really the proverbial thorn in the side of the Federalists. They were probably the most populous state. They had very liberal paper money laws, and they were the only state to not send delegates to the convention. They didn't ratify it until May of 1790. And this brings us to, finally, the Federalist Papers themselves. So, as I said, they were a series of essays published following the convention for a period of about 10 months by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. And their goal was to convince the state legislature, or the state ratifying convention of New York, to adopt the Constitution. And this brings us to, in particular, Federalist Paper number 1. And I've been talking for a while. Does anyone want to cover and introduce us to Federalist 1? I can do it.
You might as well
I'm
just
happy
keep
to.
going.
Well, go ahead.
Sorry.
Okay. All right. Well, basically, this is kind of I think its title is actually General Introduction, and it is a general introduction to their project. You know, this paper, this one's written by Hamilton. He lays out the project and he sets the tone. And in the opening line, he's really trying to emphasize that this isn't just about adopting a constitution; it's about preserving the Union. And let's see if I can actually pull up the quote here. Sorry, I don't actually have that paper pulled up.
I've got it if you need one.
You've got it? You want to quote the first line?
Sure. To the people of the state of New York, after an unequivocal experience of the inefficiency of the subsisting federal government, you are called upon to deliberate on a new constitution for the United States of America. The subject speaks its own importance, comprehending in it its consequences nothing less than the existence of the Union, the safety and welfare of the parts of which it is composed, the fate of an empire in many respects the most interesting in the world.
Yeah. Some good stuff.
Feeling pretty good about himself.
He had a
there.
way with words.
Yeah, Hamilton. I mean, yeah, if you're not too familiar with Hamilton, the way he was born, I think he was actually orphaned, wasn't he, as a child, and he was born in the
I
Caribbean.
cannot believe you.
And worked.
You've got to watch Hamilton or hear this.
Well, I watched the drunk history of the Hamilton and Burr duel, but yeah. So basically, Hamilton brought up an orphan. He worked for some merchant. I think, in the way that his kind of genius was recognized was through the letters he was writing, and eventually was shipped off to the United States. Did he go to Princeton? Is that where he went to school?
He was in New York.
King's College.
Or did he go to Princeton?
King's College.
Yeah.
Okay. And, eventually worked his way up to become General George Washington's secretary and literally formed the United States economy following the ratification of the Constitution. Yeah, I mean, he really had a way with words, and you can tell when, at least for me, I can tell which papers are Madison's and which ones are Hamilton's and which ones are Jay's or Madison's, because you definitely need a dictionary.
Funnily enough, I have a story about this because Hamilton came over here. Nobody knew who he was. I mean, he was a total unknown, but he started publishing letters right away. I mean, he always had a pen in his hands. And because he was in New York City, John Jay was the most famous lawyer in New York City at the time. And there were people in New York City who actually believed that it was John Jay writing all of these. And he would be out and he would keep telling people, no, I have no idea who's writing any of this. It is not me, I promise. And they're like, it sounds just like you. So it's funny, like 10 years later, or 20 years later, you can't, you could definitely tell the difference. But at first, people were giving John Jay all of the credit. And I think they finally met. Yeah, when they finally met, Hamilton actually came at him with a bit of an attitude, and John Jay was like, "Oh, you're that dude." And then I think they actually got along really well. But,
yeah, I think it's.
And for anybody who cares,
yeah, that was pretty much the
King's College is now Columbia. So if you're
Columbia,
okay.
Yes.
I knew it was one of the Ivy Leagues.
Yeah,
okay.
He stayed in New York. He never left. Definitely New York.
And you talk about John Jay real quick. It's worth mentioning that Hamilton spearheaded this project. He's responsible for something like 51 of the papers. So he wrote over half the papers. Jay only actually wrote 5 of the papers. He wrote 2 through 5, so that was the 4 papers. He fell ill he had to return home, and he wasn't able to contribute again until I think he wrote either the last paper or the next to last. And he also was not at the Constitutional Convention.
He wasn't, but he wasn't ill. He was Secretary of Foreign Affairs. We were going back up and forth for 3 months about this. No, but he wasn't ill.
Yeah, he was Secretary of Foreign Affairs during the convention, correct?
He was from 84 to 89. So
right,
he was
I'm talking about after, though.
Yeah, but when this was being written, he was Secretary of Foreign Affairs. This was being written in 80.
Okay,
Yeah.
I thought he fell ill. I'm
going to stay out of it.
He was just very busy. He was Secretary of Foreign. Yeah, no, this is something that I just found out.
Well, he could have fallen ill as secretary. I mean,
maybe he was just sick of writing papers.
People just keep writing him out of history. He just keeps getting written out of history. And I am a J-head, and I am bringing him back.
Laura is
going to know his name.
maybe he just pulled a Hancock.
Yeah, maybe.
I have the same problem.
Feigned illness.
I feel like Washington is super obscure, so I probably better bring him back to the forefront.
Yeah, but just again to get back to this first paper for a minute, I thought there was one quote, this portion that I want to read that was very prescient, and a lot of the stuff you're going to find, the same debates they were having back then are the same debates we're having now in a lot of cases. So I just want to read this portion real quick. He points out the following. He says, "It will be equally forgotten that the vigor of government is essential to the security of liberty, that in the contemplation of a sound and well-informed judgment, their interests can never be separated, and that a dangerous ambition more often lurks behind the specious mask of zeal for the rights of people than under the forbidden appearance of zeal for the firmness and efficiency of government. History will teach us that the former has been found a much more certain road to the introduction of despotism than the latter, and that of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants." What he's saying here is that, they're out there making this argument that we need a strong government. That is the only way you're going to secure your liberties. You need to be aware of the people who come along and say, screw government. I'm going to let you do whatever you want. Anarchy will reign if you elect a populace. Some other things he says that, he wants to approach the whole debate in a spirit of moderation. He's saying, we're not going to launch ad hominem attacks at the anti-federalists. We're going to convince you with arguments, because in the end, arguments should win the day. I think they mostly are fairly moderate, but they do kind of hide some ad hominem attacks in there a little bit. I mean, he basically goes on to say in the first paper, he says that of the anti-federalists that they're blameless, at least if not respectable, people who had been led astray by preconceived jealousies and fears. So he's basically saying, you're not bad people, you're just ignorant. So I think they do at times they kind of fall into the ad hominem attacks again. These are propaganda. They're meant to convince people to do something. They engage in rhetorical devices. It's not just pure rationality and argumentation. Is there anything else you guys want to point out from the first paper?
Well, I know that I really liked, going back to the first paragraph, he talks about how to establish good government, we need reflection and choice. And when I was reading that again this time, I was thinking, it's not just establishing good government, it's maintaining good government. It does require reflection and it requires choice. This is when he goes into whether or not it's to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. And that's, even now, we can't rely on our destiny. We really have to maintain good government through reflection and choice.
I totally love that piece. And then I also really love the quote, happy will it be if our choices should be directed by a judicious estimate of our true interests, unperplexed and unbiased by considerations not connected with the public good. But this is a thing more ardently to be wished for than seriously expected. And I think we'll see that a couple times more throughout the papers, but basically there's a real understanding of special interests and a real recognition of the populist obsequiousness to court the people, things like that. The idea that we are not perfect, we are all subject to these special interests, we are all subject to all these outside influences, and although we recognize that we all have sort of the Washingtonian in us, that spirit of deep loyalty, commitment, and selflessness, I think he is really recognizing that people are not that, actually. Or if there are a couple of us out there like that, that it's really something to be wished for, not expected, that the majority of the people in the government would be.
Yeah.
Yeah. So towards the end of the paper, he again, this is called general introduction, so he's using this to explain what his project is. And what he does is he basically breaks down into 6 different areas what the Federalist Papers are going to be about. So I'm just going to run through those real quick. 1, the utility of the Union to your political prosperity. 2, the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve that Union. 3, the necessity of a government at least as energetic as the one proposed to the attainment of this object. 4, the conformity of the proposed Constitution to the true principles of Republican government. 5, its analogy to your own state constitution. And 6, the additional security which its adoption will afford to the preservation of that species of government, to liberty and to property. And I also do want to mention real quick, they did calling themselves Federalists, that was like a brilliant trick of political labeling. They wanted to grab onto this popular term that actually made it sound like they were more populist than they were. It's kind of arguable that the anti-federalists were really the more federalist-leaning bunch, federalism in the sense of a federated system of government where you have this division between federal and state governments, implying that states have a lot of power. But remember, these guys, they wanted the national government to have a lot more power, at least a lot more power than they did at the time. So that was a little bit of a political messaging trick. And, I mentioned at the beginning that there was this other project going on, the Anti-Federalist Papers. So the Anti-Federalist Papers were not a coherent project in the same way that the Federalist Papers were. They were basically just collections of the hundreds of writings that came out against the proposed Constitution. And, there are hundreds of these, but what's interesting is that I think in 1965, a professor at Columbia University, Morton Borden, just combed through these hundreds of papers and pamphlets and essays and pulled out 85 of them that roughly corresponded with each one of the 85 Federalist Papers. So you can kind of get an idea, looking at that collection, of what the anti-federalist arguments were. The thing is, they're kind of hit and miss, right? So some of them are more reflective, some of them are more moderate in tone, and then some of them are not. And we'll be talking about the Anti-Federalist Papers as well here and there. I do want to read a quote from Anti-Federalist Paper number 1, which is entitled "A Dangerous Plan of Benefit Only to the Aristocratic Combination." So towards the end, they're basically just saying like, oh, the only reason the Federalists are proposing this is because it's good for them. They can get all these cool jobs in government, and it just benefits the lawyers and the bankers and all these people. And actually, funny enough, it was actually signed by someone using the pseudonym A Federalist. So I just want to read the last paragraph here. It says, "These consist generally of the noble order of Cincinnatus, holders of public securities, men of great wealth and expectations of public office, bankers and lawyers. These, with their train of dependents, form the aristocratic combination. The lawyers in particular keep up an incessant declamation for its adoption. Like greedy gudgeons, they long to satiate their voracious stomachs with the golden bait. The numerous tribunals to be erected by the new plan of consolidated empire will find employment for 10 times their present numbers. These are the loaves and fishes for which they hunger." Everyone likes to pick on lawyers.
They were like worried about an industry of attorneys.
Right.
They're legitimately worried about an industry of attorneys.
That's been a common.
Lawyers.
They ruin it for everybody.
Now we have to give ourselves like some kind of rating.
Yeah, we're not that bad. We like lawyers. We're good people.
Yeah, I think it's interesting also
Some
that
of us.
he talks about the Society of the Cincinnati, or the Cincinnatus, which was the hereditary society from the U.S. and France, founded in 1783, the year of the Newburgh Conspiracy, preserving the ideals and fellowship of the officers of the Continental Army who served in the Revolutionary War, which, of course, Washington was a member of this. And if you get the chance to go down, to D.C., you may see some of the actual, they had like special china that had a emblem on it, and it's pretty fancy stuff.
Actually, one of the really funny things about the Society of Cincinnatus, Washington, for a while, people were trying to persuade him to come to the convention to lend weight to it. He was actually pretty reluctant to take part in it. Part of the reason was, again, at this time, he had decided that he wanted to be retired from public life, but also they weren't sure if it was going to fail, and that might stain his credibility if it later failed. But one of the big reasons he didn't go was because at the same time, the Society of Cincinnatus was also having a meeting in Philadelphia while the convention was taking place, and he already told them that the Cincinnatus, that he couldn't make it, so it would be awkward if he then went there to go to the convention.
That's really funny.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully he did ultimately attend the convention.
Oh yeah.
Not to wax poetic about Washington, but it is interesting that he, like I said, he was a very...
Please wax away.
I guess I'm in the right crowd for that, but it's this really interesting balance between him being sort of like this stainless persona, but then also just really, really self-aware of his image, and really, he was ambitious in a way that I don't think he normally gets credit for. So I think it's interesting because it is all reputational, like that strategy, like I can't do this because I already said I wouldn't do this, and very reputational.
Actually, another this is completely random and completely off topic, but another funny thing about Washington that I remember reading was that when he was a general, so his skills as a politician were pretty unmatched. He really was a leader.
He was like the most popular man in the country other than Benjamin Franklin, I think, at the time.
Probably still is.
Yeah, they really wanted him at the convention because his presence alone would give enormous weight to it. But one of the funny thing was, apparently his skills as a military tactician were not actually all that great. He had this habit of drawing up just these insanely complicated battle plans where you have like 5 or 6 different columns of troops that had to cross these expanses of land like in the middle of the night, all at different times, and then hopefully, if everything goes perfectly according to plan, converge on their target and just overwhelm the enemy. But then, you have to deal with real world things like weather and the absence of light when it's night out and people getting tired, and most of these insanely complicated plans just completely fell apart. I mean, one of the things about the Revolutionary War is there was a lot of luck on the part of the Americans in winning certain battles, and I just think it's kind of funny that like he's this great leader, but then like he actually wasn't all that great at military strategy.
No, well, I read somewhere one of his strategies was that he realized to win the war wasn't to win the battles. Like he wasn't going to win the war by winning the battles. It was really just by like keeping his men alive. So it didn't even matter to him at certain points whether.
Well, yeah, they basically. Yeah,
it was just like, just outlast the British, and it was true. He had that foresight, and he also understood that the constitutional or the Continental Army was far more important than the Continental Congress at times, and I think he really did put them as a priority and pushed for them and advocated for them and tried to get them the supplies that they needed. But he was like constantly failed by this Congress, but never gave up on them. He was always like Such a patriot. He never gave up on anyone, really. It was admirable.
And one of the things that really helped them win the war was that, you had these militiamen who didn't fight in professional military, so they didn't understand the regular rules of war. Like when your capital is taken over by the enemy, you're supposed to surrender. And the British were really confused as to why the Americans were not surrendering. So, yeah, I mean, essentially, I mean, what ended up happening with the war was that the Americans just outlasted the British. The British just gave up because it was getting so expensive and so difficult to continue fighting this war that they gave up.
Sometimes I can just hear King George from the musical singing while you're talking. So you've got to see it. Hey, listeners, if we actually have listeners, you need to, I think if we got enough people to tell us that Joseph needs to listen to Hamilton, I think we could make him do it.
Well, I want to see it in person. It's coming to Columbus in 2018. Ooh. I plan on buying tickets.
Okay.
I will go see it. I will maybe listen to it beforehand.
I'll drive down to see it with you guys.
And you guys, I don't know if you're down with me, but I'm willing to write a musical on the Constitution.
Oh, I am so with you.
All right, good.
I really favor an interpretive dance, though.
Well, it's a musical. We got it all.
Overarching all this, just everything we've talked about tonight, and I think this kind of calls into exactly why we're doing this, is this idea in the power of reason, and in the power of persuasion, in the power of words, in the power of, reality put in front of people, allowing people to weigh their self-interest in the face of all things, acknowledging that there are powerful personalities at play, and that we're all swayed by different things. I think that kind of, that recognition in the Federalist Papers, and that is exactly what they're for. That really sort of hits home with me in our current climate. So I don't know if you guys found that powerful at all, but especially with Newburgh, where Washington gets up there and quells the unrest, and he doesn't quell it sort of using platitudes or telling everybody everything's going to be okay, but just by saying, listen, what you're facing, I'm facing it with you, and look, I've been worn out with you, and let's just, let's keep trying, let's have some more faith in people and in the general integrity of our leaders. And I think, it's a little encouraging right now, and it's also reassuring that this is a historic problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think, again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I think people need to stand back. They need to take a deep breath. They need to think about this stuff, and they need to listen to other people.
Yeah.
And this whole podcast and this whole thing, exploring the Federalist Papers and exploring what happened in the years following the Revolutionary War and the Revolutionary War itself, we're not experts. I've just been reading about this stuff for the past several months. This is going to be kind of a shared voyage of discovery, I think, for us and anyone listening as well.
Yes.
Any of the two people listening to this podcast.
We're all gonna.
Yeah, I would like to put out there, I'm a total amateur. I am not a historian. I am an attorney who has just read some books.
I completely second that. Third that here.
Yeah, I studied political science and philosophy in college, so I have a small, little bit of a background in this, but not, super robust. And so, I think we being attorneys, we're all forced to go through at least one semester of constitutional law, so we have some grounding in some of this. But again, we are not historians. We are not by any means experts.
No, but we are believers in the rule of law, and that is what our continental and constitutional and all of these Congresses that met, that's what they were all pushing for, to be a country based on the rule of law and not a monarchy or any other sort of government.
Country of laws, not of men.
Not of men.
And we hope to,
yes.
Or women. We're trying to be inclusive.
Right.
Well, not back then.
But I do think that brings up also another point, is that we are looking at anti-federalist papers and things like that. We are, and as attorneys, we are trained to look at the other arguments, not only so that we can make ours better, but to understand what we're facing and to try to find the weaknesses in our own perspectives. So I hope that we're going to bring that voice here too. I think you may have heard a little bit of it tonight, but I think we will try to balance it out with sort of the arguments, counter arguments for all these pieces.
Yeah, and actually I can just throw, like, just real quick, just a couple of them in there now, just some of the concerns that the Anti-Federalists had. They were, legitimate. They feared a standing army. They had experience with the British and the British military, setting up what was essentially martial law in the United States prior to the Revolutionary War. They were concerned about the lack of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Again,
valid,
that was
totally valid.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons for the holdouts. They thought taxes would go up and become unbearable because, again, you had this whole thing with taxation without representation. That was one of the driving reasons behind the Revolutionary War. Their concerns were legitimate, but ultimately, everyone did kind of agree. Again, both the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists agreed that the Articles of Confederation were shitty. They all agreed that something needed to change. But, the Federalists won out. They managed to control a lot of the process. And what we were left with was, thankfully, a resounding success. America obviously is now the only superpower. And so it definitely worked, what they did. Not that America doesn't have problems. Yeah, not that America doesn't have problems and not that there weren't problems then, but, I think it definitely worked overall. So, on the next episode of United We Pod, we'll be talking about foreign force and influence. We'll be covering Federalist Papers 2 through 5, which were the ones written by John Jay.
Rah-rah, John Jay!
Rah-rah. And we might talk a little bit about Russia as well, which for some reason seems to keep popping up in the news. Not really sure why. But thanks for joining us.